HCAM TV thanks you for watching this presentation. We'd love for you to become a member and use your creativity at our station. Please visit hinghammedia.org or call us at 781-836-5094 if you would like to learn more.
All right, folks, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Can the folks in the back hear me all right? Good enough? Good, all right. I didn't want to be a schmuck and have to use a microphone, but if I'm being honest, the library didn't teach me how to use one, so we'll do the best we can. I'll project as well as possible here. My name is Peter Murata. I am the Engagement Site Manager at World's End Reservation, and I've held that position now for about a year. It's an exciting job, it's a fun job. Sometimes it's a stressful job. World's End has been a fairly active property for the past couple of years now at least. You know, it's been a flagship property for the trustees since it was acquired back in '67. And so it really is a joy to work at that property and to today bring the story to you. Before we get started, I'd really like to thank the Hingham Public Library for hosting us, not just tonight, but for a handful of other lectures. We'll be doing one next week, same time, same place, and the week after, so the 17th and the 24th. I'd love to thank Linda Harper, the library director, and Michael Achille, the local history librarian, who worked with us pretty diligently to bring this to life and to help us celebrate 50 years of World's End. Libraries for generations and right through this current age have been an arena for public discourse. It's where ideas are brought to the table, people discuss, people learn, people understand more about the ways of the world and current events that are happening. And so what better a place to talk about a place like World's End, a property that so many people adore, and a property that certainly a lot of people discuss, whether it's in the pages of the Hingham Journal or discuss in passing, saying hi to strangers or with friends as they walk along the paths of Planters Hill. You know, it's certainly a joy to be here, and I couldn't think of a better area to give this discussion. I'd also like to say before we begin that I'd like to give credit to some of the sources where information came from for tonight's lecture. One of them being A History of World's End. It was written by William and Willard Walker, two former owners or family members of the owners of World's End. And then additionally, there was a publication called Saving Special Places. This was written by Gordon Abbott Jr., a beloved and longtime director of the Trustees of Reservations. And then finally, a smaller publication called A Delicate Balance. This was written by a historian by the name of Electa Trish. She's from Concord, and she contributed to our 2002 World's End Management Plan. And her small piece and her contribution to that made a large impact on a lot of the information we'll share tonight. We will have time after the lecture, hopefully, for some questions and comments. So as we go through it, if there's anything that strikes a nerve or something that you think is particularly interesting, feel free to ask a question at the end. We'll go around the room, and I'll do my best to answer questions. I'm sure there'll be one or two questions that I get asked frequently that I never have an answer to, but we'll get there when we get there. Finally, just a precursor to that lecture series that I mentioned. On next Thursday, it will be not just myself. I'm happy to host tonight, but next Thursday I will be leading a lecture along with longtime Hingham resident and longtime World's End Ranger Ryland Rogers, who has a very intimate story and a personal connection over 50 years in relationship with World's End, and his story is not to be missed. So if you're here tonight, make sure to come next week as well. And then on the last lecture, on the 24th, we'll be working with the library's own Michael Achille to discuss the Brewer family. I'm assuming a good handful of you in this room, that name rings a bell. We're going to talk not just about the Brewer family's legacy at World's End, but their impact in the town of Hingham and their contributions to the town, and really what is a legacy of philanthropy. With all that being said, let's begin. My first visit to World's End was in the summer of 2013. At that time, I was a young landscape architect. I worked at a office right here in Hingham, doing mostly residential design work. And when I found out about a large property in Hingham designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, only about 5 minutes from my office door, I quickly made plans to take a visit. Right after work, I drove down Martin's Lane. I was greeted by Linda White at the gatehouse, and off I went. And I can vividly remember that first time walking the cart paths and looking out into the fields. And when I did, and I'm hoping this resonates with some of you, you can almost get a sense for what those fields have seen, almost as if like the ghost of a farmer or an old farmhand could just be around the corner. You know, the cart paths feel very familiar. They feel well worn, well used, but the fields, they seem kind of ancient, almost sacred even. And the trees between the two, between the cart paths and the fields, almost work as a veil or as a guide to say you can look through, but don't go in. Just appreciate from a distance. I can also remember, you know, as a young landscape architect, saying to myself, this is most definitely an Olmsted landscape. Look at these, you know, curving cart paths, the views, the long views, the framing of the picturesque as what he would have been trying to achieve, as he did with so many of his properties, and just the way that you move through the landscape effortlessly. It was very Olmstedian, you know. And I remember getting helplessly lost on my first visit to World's End, as I'd imagine most people their first time going to the property do. You walk out, you know, after arriving, and you're immediately welcomed by these century-old trees, this gracious cart path. You walk through the property, and you kind of get whisked away. You get entranced by the magic of World's End. And you become a little bit more adventurous. You say, oh, I guess I'm willing to get lost today. This seems great. It's a beautiful day. You feel a little bit more adventurous, and you walk along these cart paths, and the next thing you know, you're on a narrow footpath in Rocky Neck, and you look around, and you realize you walked past the same tree more than once, and you're helplessly lost. And that was certainly the case for me. And all you can say is, you know, I hope I get out of here before the sun goes down. I did. Here I am today. In 2015, I applied and got hired to be a part-time World's End Ranger. This was a perfect position for me. I was still working full-time at the design firm, and I was able to work at World's End on the weekends, greeting visitors, learning about the property. And it was a little while after I got started that a trustee staff person at the time had asked if I'd be interested in doing perhaps a guided walk. You know, I was a landscape architect. Did I want to focus on Frederick Law Olmsted, his design intent of the property? And I was happy to undertake it. It was a fun project. While doing that, I learned a lot about the property. And it was in that research, along with my interactions with two gentlemen, that really informed my perspective on World's End. I got a chance to meet Ryland Rogers, and I got a chance to meet a gentleman by the name of Paul Lindell, who, you know, through multiple talks on the front porch of the gatehouse, where I sat there and listened to these gentlemen tell me their knowledge and their stories about the property, I was able to shape my own perspective and gain an appreciation through their stories about what World's End is really all about. You know, and that's really, you know, I tell my story, a brief story really, because that is what World's End is about. It's not just a collection of stories, but World's End, at its core, at its essence, is a story of man's relationship with the landscape. That's been the case through the years. Let's see if that comes back up. There we go. And it's still the case today. I'm sure that many of you in here today have your own story of World's End. I'd imagine that most of you had a chance to visit it. If not, I'd hope that by the time you're done here today, you'll take a chance to get there tomorrow. If you go on the weekend, I'd recommend getting there early. Most of you know what that means. I've probably spent, for the past 2 years, maybe once a week, sometimes almost daily, I get out at World's End, sometimes more than once a day. But for some of you and for some of our visitors, that's inconsequential. We welcome visitors to World's End who have been coming there for 20, 30, sometimes 40 and 50 years. And as a matter of fact, as a ranger and now in my position as an engagement site manager, I still get a chance to welcome people every once in a while at the gatehouse. And a common question is, well, have you been here before? And an answer we love to hear is, well, yes, but I haven't been here for a very long time. And they'll say something along the lines of, I haven't been here for 25 years. And then they'll go on to tell you, as a matter of fact, I grew up around here, and we used to come here all the time. My parents used to take me here. Then they'll kind of get lost in their own story, right? They go ahead and tell you about some facts that they find fascinating about the property, most of which we already know, but we entertain them as we listen to them tell us. And then they'll surprise you with some facts that you haven't heard, that haven't been documented. And they tell it with some real pride, right? This is their story of World's End. And it speaks to the relationship that people develop with this landscape. Whether they had come there just once a long time ago because of a friend, or perhaps they went there on a date, or perhaps they were like many folks who still come to World's End. They grew up in the World's End neighborhood. They grew up in Hingham. Perhaps they were a part of the fundraising effort back in '67, and they come by and check up on things. They always ask, so is this still there? Is that still there? Hey, does so-and-so still work here? Has anything changed? And we try to tell them, well, the bridge is fairly new. But once you get past the bridge, all the fields are still there, the trees are still growing, the views are still the same. So this is all to say, like I said, World's End is a relationship. Tonight's lecture is titled "The Story of World's End." Its place, its people, the land, and its heritage. And you can't tell the story of World's End without diving into the people who really shaped the land. And that's critical to understand, is that there's a push and pull. There's kind of a tug on both ends. Not only do we get informed when we go to World's End and we experience the landscape, but then, of course, through the generations and even now, we still shape the land ourselves. So there's this mutual shaping. We go there and we take it all in. We leave a different person from when we entered. I can't tell you how many people come and they say, work was just crazy today. I got to get out at World's End for a little while. Or the kids are really driving me nuts. I have to get out here and just get some peace and quiet. And it's remarkable how people change from the time they cross the bridge and then the time they cross back. Hopefully they cross back on time, as sunsets can keep people out there for a while. We'll go on tonight to talk about this relationship, and we won't go back too far. We'll only go back about 10,000 years. We'll discuss what's probably the greatest impact to the land itself at that time, and then we'll get into what was Native American inhabitants of the land. We'll talk about really the earliest forms of vegetation that World's End saw. And then we'll flash forward to the colonial period and really understand what developed during that time, and how, in a lot of ways, what happened then can still be seen today if you know what you're looking for. Beyond the colonial era, we'll get into a period of mid-1800 to the turn of the century, where John Brewer and the Brewer family started to make their mark at World's End. And I suppose if it wasn't for the activity 10,000 years ago, you could say that John Brewer had the biggest impact on the land, but we'll get into that. Beyond that, John Brewer will introduce us to Frederick Law Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted will introduce us to Charles Eliot. Charles Elliott will end up by introducing us to the trustees of reservations. And somewhere in the middle of all that, we'll talk about what happened through the 20s and 30s and past the world wars as World's End saw multiple development threats and different ideas of what could be out there. World's End first took its distinctive shape, the place we know today, back about 10,000 years ago. So these hills, the way that they rise up out of the water and the way that the low points connect them, this was all the work of the Wisconsin Glacier as it retreated over the landscape, again, about 10,000 years ago. Now, experts will say that in some cases, perhaps there was multiple eras of glaciation that shaped World's End. I'm perfectly fine believing that. If you know the property well, there's the very well-known hills and Pine Hill, Planters Hill, and the hills of World's End proper. But then there's another section of the property, Rocky Neck. There's the Oak Hickory Forest, a completely different type of landscape when you look at the geology. And you look at these two landscapes and you say, yeah, they're distinct in their own way, and perhaps they were shaped by two different time periods. That's all good and well. But let's focus on what happened about 10,000 years ago. For those of you who need a refresher in geology and how glaciers shaped not just World's End, but most of our New England landscape here, the Wisconsin Glacier is retreating, right? And as it moves, it leaves behind all kinds of debris. What's happening is the bottom of the glacier has picked up all kinds of sediment and debris. It's all stuck to the bottom of this big chunk of ice. And as it moves over the land, there's probably different areas that rise up, maybe chunks of bedrock, chunks of ledge, that as the glacier moves over, these chunks, these sharp areas, scrape off the bottom of the glacier, and what's left behind are these earthy deposits, sediments, maybe large rocks. And that's certainly the case what happened in World's End. I love this image because, well, we'll get into some other aspects of it, but you see a little bit of Hull off in the distance. You see Bumpkin Island at the top of the screen, a little bit of a hint of one of the Hingham Harbor Islands. But what you get is a small scope of what is the larger Boston Harbor Basin. So picture all the harbor islands, picture what would have been the hills of Boston itself. Many of them have been long ago cut down and developed on. Picture the hills of Hingham, Otis Hill, Turkey Hill, and even the sections of land out in Hull itself. Most of them are composed of sections of hill and then narrow areas that connect the two. All of these are left over from the last glaciation, and they all represent small chunks of bedrock that was underneath that ended up by sloughing off and scraping the bottom of the glacier and leaving behind these deposits. We call them drumlins. And it's interesting. I mean, you don't totally get a sense for it here, but if you look at a topographic map, you look at an aerial image looking straight down on the harbor islands and World's End, and you'll notice that all these hills, they're all elongated, they're all spoon-shaped, or if you cut an egg in half and placed it on a table, they have a distinctive shape, and they're all pointing in the same direction. Generally, they're pointing in the direction that the glacier was retreating. And so, you get this zoomed out perspective, and it really tells a story. Now, after the glacier retreats, we're left with all this sediment. The best way I could describe what the landscape would have looked like at that time is if any of you had the chance to go hiking in the White Mountains, you got up to maybe the peak of Lafayette or the peak of Washington or Adams, and you get this sense of what an alpine landscape looks like: rocky, bouldery, deposits of soil and earth, and then in different areas, the alpine vegetation, very low growing, perhaps sedges, lichen, and as you come down from the summits, you start to enter areas that might have ferns, very low growing bushes, understory plants. World's End would have started as just a rocky heap. And over time, as vegetation could establish itself, it would have become more and more wooded. Now, the coastline of World's End is very distinct, and it's what we come to expect when we see it today. At that time, that would not have been the case. Remember, most of the Earth's water is held up in ice. If the majority of you are from Hingham, or at least know Hingham, if you go to Brood Awakening or go down to the Hingham Bathing Beach at low tide, it's just a mudflat. There's not a whole lot of water on top of the Earth there. All of that at this time, there would have been no water. The coastline would have been much further out, and it all would have been exposed. And with that exposure, and over all these years, vegetation would have grown in those areas too. We know that for a fact, as a matter of fact, in the 1850s, and then later on in the 1920s as Rockland Street and George Washington Boulevard were being built, when excavation was done for those roadways. And they dug out and they started developing the base layer. What they found as they plowed through mostly of what is, you could call, the Ware River estuary, underneath the peat and all the muck that's out there, gigantic, absolutely gigantic ancient tree stumps. The likes of which, consider the great, sequoias or the redwoods of the West Coast. Forests like that used to grow here on the East Coast. And as the waters rose and these trees succumbed to that inundation, the stumps of which were preserved under the salt water, and layer upon layer of earth started to fill in, water filled up. We get the coast we see today, but if you were to go out to World's End and you decided to dig down as far as you could without getting stuck in the muck in the area called Damned Meadow, more likely than not, you would find ancient tree stumps, gigantic trees that used to grow in this area. If we flash forward a little bit, and we have the hills of World's End established, we have the vegetation in there, we get to a Native American period. There was two eras of Native American inhabitation that came through World's End, the first being primarily nomadic. So folks who came through, they may have done some fishing in what would have been a much different Ware River at the time, but they tried their luck with fishing, maybe some hunting. And then they moved on. They'd stay for a day, move on. And then much later, there would have been a semi-nomadic group of Native Americans that passed through. And these folks would have ended up by having summer camps at World's End in the protected coves on the edge of the Ware River, which you can see beyond that last wooded patch there. And basically any of these coves that have a southeasterly facing front, it was more protected, and that's where they would have had summer camps. The same is true for any of the harbor islands. There's evidence all through the harbor islands that Native Americans did end up by having summer camps, but no permanent dwellings. You don't think of it the same way as you think of the Native Americans that European colonists would have experienced, say, in Plymouth. They were not permanent settlements. They just spent some time on the land and moved through. What impact would they have had? I think that for the most part, perhaps some burning, some clearing for their camps, but for the most part, very light. They would have left remains behind of all kinds of things, perhaps the things they were eating or some of the tools that they had used while they were there, but not as great of an impact. It's just significant that now it's a landscape that can sustain life for humans. And in a shorter period of time, even just for summer camps. It was probably not too long after Hingham was settled that our colonial forefathers discovered World's End. Bear Cove, founded about 1633. A couple years later, 1635, it becomes the colony of Hingham. And it was right around that time, for the best we can understand, sometime before 1635, that a gentleman by the name of Abraham Martin first wandered down towards this land and established for himself a dwelling, I would say at the very end of Martin's Lane, if you can picture it, right before our gate. Right before the stone pillars that welcome people in. So Martin's Lane, Martin's Cove Road But most importantly, Martin's Well is what Abraham Martin was known for. He had a fresh water source, which can still be found if you know what you're looking for, although probably perhaps long dried up. And this was a landmark. This was a wayfinding instrument. People knew how to work their way towards this piece of the town of Hingham now because of Abraham Martin's first settlement down there. When colonial settlers, when European settlers first made their way to World's End, it would have been by boat or barge. What we see here in this picture just disappeared. Is, for lack of a better term, a peninsula. But that wasn't the case in the 1600s. At the end of Martin's Lane and into that last chunk of wooded land, from there, Pine Hill and Planters Hill would have been cut off from the mainland. It would have been its own island. And then even further on, World's End proper, which I'll call it by that name for all intents and purposes. You know, what we see now is World's End Reservation, but the last two hills, that last stretch, has always been what's called just World's End. That too was its own island, perhaps connected at low tide, but at high tide completely cut off. So when colonial settlers first showed up, they were coming by boat or barge. And when they got here, they quickly found ways to use the land and to develop their relationship with the land, really for sustenance, for survival, and for thriving in this colonial life that they've set up for themselves. Whatever was left of a forested landscape at World's End was soon almost 100% completely eliminated. Colonial settlers, the likes of which are kind of a who's who of Hinghamites, Thayers, the Loud family, the Barnes family, the Lincoln family, all of whom had property at World's End. They would have came. They would have cleared, as we see in some of these fields here, completely the drumlins, and they would have started using this land for agricultural purposes. In areas that they cut trees down, but they found the land unsuitable for planting of hay or crops, they simply would have used those areas as woodlots to harvest lumber, building ships and homes. And this went on through the colonial period, all the way up into the early to mid 1800s. Examples of the colonial era that we see today at World's End are fairly evident. After some time getting there by boat and barge, it was too long after that they said, this land is precious, the soil quality out here is great, we need to find an easier way to access this land. And they built two dam roads, two causeways in the 1600s to connect to the mainland in order to get farming equipment back and forth. One of these is still completely intact, and it's on the far edge of the dammed meadow where it meets the Ware River. The other one has been broken through, and now salt water inundates what is the dammed meadow, how it always had prior to these dams' construction. They also took the area known as the Bar, the thin strip of land that connects Planters Hill to World's End proper, and they built that up so that it could be accessed at all times. This was probably, in some cases, even more significant. The land out at World's End itself, World's End proper, was significantly more valuable than the land on Pine Hill and Planters Hill. We know this because Hingham actually kept pretty good records of it. During this period of colonization, there was numerous, almost an unending list of land sales and transactions out on these hills. And every time they sold, compared to other parcels of land in the town of Hingham, they always sold for the highest price, especially the land out at World's End itself. It's highly valuable land for hay production, for some crops, and in some cases for grazing, which we'll get into even a little bit later as we discuss John Brewer. And so this was the mark of the colonial settlers. There was the causeways, the area they built up along the Bar, and then of course it's more obvious things. And I'm not sure if everyone who experiences World's End really dwells on it, but when you walk past the stone wall at World's End, that wall's been there for 300 years at least, most of them anyways. When you look out into those fields, the same fields that I know that our stewardship team was managing just 2 days ago, those fields have been open and cleared for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is the remnants of a colonial age. And then if you really have a keen eye and you get off the beaten path, say if you were to enter World's End through the path on the far end of our last parking lot, right? And you walk through the wooded area that's a oak hickory forest. And you get off the main path in there and you start walking on some of the narrow paths that cut through the woods. You'll soon notice, if you have a keen enough eye and you can study the landscape, that these aren't just footpaths. And you look around and you see small retaining walls. You see areas where the natural landscape has been cut away, and in other areas filled in. And what you're looking at are colonial era cart paths that would have been used in that area to cart and transport lumber back and forth. Some of them would have been bypass roads. Again, there was multiple landowners out here, some of them more private than others, and in order to get to your land, you couldn't always go through someone else's land, and you had to go around it. And there's evidence of this all over World's End. And again, in this oak hickory forest, if you can read the landscape, you'll walk through there and you'll see these oak trees. And you know, if I asked a 5-year-old right now to draw an oak tree, certainly they'd draw a tree with a big canopy, probably a hole in it with a Woody the Woodpecker coming out of it, or a robin flying around, and it would most definitely 100% have one trunk. When you walk through the oak hickory forest, you see oak trees that have 2, 3, sometimes 4 trunks, 4 leaders. This is unusual, and it's another timestamp that if you know what you're looking for, you can say there's been activity through here. There's been something that happened. This is not normal. And what you're looking at are trees that, again, early colonists would have cleared all the land. But they're only going to plant in areas that are suitable for planting. If you walk through that section, you'll notice there's a lot of ledge, a lot of rocks that are left over, it was not suitable for planting. And so what they would have done is they would have cut trees down, used the trees for lumber, but they would have left the stumps. There's no reason to get rid of the stumps. They'd only get rid of stumps if they wanted to plant there. And so when they left the stumps, what they didn't realize was going to happen was the stumps were still going to draw energy out of the ground, and they were going to produce what's called stump growth. So small spurts, shoots that come up out of the stump, normally a multitude of them, say 20, 30 small shoots that come up out of the stump. It's called stump growth. And they start to grow up, and they outcompete each other until what's left is maybe, again, 2, 3, 4 mature leaders that grow up. If you go out there today and you look at these trees, what you're really looking at is a stump that could be something like 500, 600 years old, perhaps. And you're looking at leaders that are in the neighborhood of 150, perhaps 200 years old. They're not the healthiest trees. Some of them are holding on longer than others. It's not a normal way for a tree to grow, and so they're more susceptible to disease. But while they're here, you can look at them and really get an understanding of a timestamp on the landscape and the way we've shaped it. There are other indications of colonial activity on the property. There's some other roads that if you get off the beaten path, you'll discover them. You'll find small cobblestones built into them. As you walk along them, you'll understand, oh, this is where they must have landed with a boat. I'm walking this path in the opposite direction of where they actually would have been entering. I'm exiting, and this is where they would have been coming in from. That looks like a nice cove to have landed a barge. These are all indications of that colonial era. And then you have things like this. I hope most of you are familiar with these trees. They're affectionately known as the 7 oaks. These trees are most likely some of the oldest trees we have on the property. If you're coming up from the gatehouse and you walked over the bridge, come up Pine Hill, and as you start to turn just subtly and work your way through the flats between the 2 hills, these trees will be running perpendicular to all the carriage road trees. And they're fairly distinct. They're certainly at just about a mature size. They'll continue to grow slowly at this point. And what you have here is just another indicator of activity on the property, and it speaks to this idea of land swaps and buyouts and the relationship that these colonial planters had with the landscape. And so we know for a fact that what these trees represent is a property line. So when you walk past them and you look out, you can say, okay, that land belonged to someone, and the land on the other side of the trees belonged to someone else. We know that because during a great storm not too long ago, where these trees cross over the cart path, the roadway got washed away in the storm, and underneath the roadway was exposed a base layer of stones that would have been part of a stone wall. So before these trees were here, there was a stone wall that represented a property line. The stone wall got removed and the trees got planted. This is a strong indication that what ended up by happening was that there was a buyout. One gentleman said, hey, I like your land, I have X number of dollars, would you mind selling it to me? Or perhaps it was a marriage and it was time to combine the two fields. But we weren't going to lose the property line because chances are we were going to sell it again at some point. So you remove the stone wall, you get farming equipment back and forth now, the fields can share labor, but you mark the path with these trees. On an early survey of World's End that dates to mid-1800s or so, these trees were not listed. But at that time, the trees probably would have been almost about 100 years old. But they weren't noted on the plan. There was just a line there that shows a property line. And that, again, is an indication that these trees weren't considered trees at the time. They're considered a fence or a property line or a wall. Other trees were noted, these ones weren't. And it's remarkable that they aren't when you take them in today. This period of land trade, buyouts, this is going on and on and on. And it continues right up into the 1800s. And it comes to a full stop with this gentleman, Mr. John R. Brewer. The Brewer family came to Hingham early to mid 1800s, and they actually established a summer house for themselves not too far from here on Levitt Street, a yellow house right down the road from the library. And around 1850, 1853, John Brewer, pictured here, is getting a little tired of living with his parents at the summer house, sharing it with his siblings, and he wants his own space. He's ready to break out. 1855, he finds for himself property available on Martin's Lane, and he buys it. This would start a land acquisition campaign by John Brewer that would last for about 30 years. His first initial purchase was about 24 acres or so. He would go on to amass over 400 acres, pretty close to 450 acres. Now, to put that in perspective, World's End itself, you know, when you pass through the gatehouse and you get into the property, that's 251 acres from there on to the very end. He ended up by purchasing land all the way back up Martin's Lane, on both sides of it even, and then he went on to go ahead and purchase land out in the water. He purchased two of the Hingham Harbor Islands, Sarah and Langley Island. From what we understand, he purchased them just to protect the view from his mainland. There was no good reason to buy them. They weren't good for planting. They didn't have any notable vegetation on them. He just wanted to protect the view. And it's actually an important anecdote. It shows that he had some sense of aesthetic value, that he cared about how things looked. It didn't come so easy for him to acquire all this land. There was two holdouts, and it's still pretty evident on the property today. There was the Loud family, and there was the Barnes family, who weren't quite ready to sell out to the almighty John Brewer. As you're walking through World's End and you make it past Pine Hill and you start working away at Planter's Hill, there's a long stone wall that runs all along one of the only straight paths in World's End. At this time, when that cart path was being built, that land on the other side of the stone wall still belonged to the Barnes family. John Brewer had yet to acquire it, even though it was pretty inevitable that he would. And then again, if you get into the very far edge of our last parking lot and you get out into that wooded area, that's the Loud family lot. And again, He was not keen on selling out to John Brewer, and his land was fairly private. There's a number of bypass roads that colonial settlers would have had to take, and John Brewer himself, despite being somewhat of a Boston Brahmin, would still have to work his way around the Loud Lot until much later. So the campaign of land acquisition goes on for about 30 years, again, 450 acres. And as he's getting near the end of it, and as he's getting older, he has all this land amassed. Along the way, he established for himself a gentleman's farm. He had a prized herd of Jersey cattle. He had some show horses. There were sheep. There were certainly chickens. And yes, it was a farm for all intents and purposes, but this was not a traditional working farm. It's a gentleman's farm, and that's important to note. At this time we're building up towards the turn of the century, and you have these wealthy upper class who are, they established business for themselves in Boston, or perhaps other notable cities, maybe New Bedford, maybe Nantucket. And they're kind of pining, they're yearning for a bucolic age that's been passed. Industry has taken over. They're in the smog of the cities as industry is growing and growing, and they're trying to find ways to escape that. Remember, so the Brewers had a summer house. What John Brewer went on to do past his own family is kind of build a farm that allowed him to remember what picturesque New England used to look like. And these happened all over New England. Another trustee's property, the Bradley estate over in Canton, is another fine example of that. It's a country estate, where you can leave the stresses of the city behind and remember what bucolic New England used to look like. But nonetheless, a farm it was, and it was called World's End Farm for a long time. We'll go through some of the images that speak to that. There was hired help. John Brewer was not a farmer. He fancied himself a farmer, but there was all kinds of gentlemen who came through the farm, who lived on the property at the Brewer estate and worked there and kept the place running. Hired help was something that continued even past the time of John Brewer. It continued right up until the very age that the trustees took over the property. Here's a great image that speaks to what was then and what is now. If you look at these stone pillars, and they have these cannonballs rested on top, it's pretty stately. These stone pillars are very, very similar to the stone pillars that you would drive through when you come to World's End itself. But they're not the same ones, but they are, in fact, still there. There's two sets of stone pillars on Martin's Lane itself as you drive down towards World's End that both belonged to the old Brewer estate. And these ones in particular, you can see right past those trees was the entrance to the homestead itself. These columns are still there. The curving walls that come out of them, I know they're a little bit cut off. It's all very recognizable. So keep your eyes peeled the next time you head down Martin's Lane. Believe it or not, I believe that this structure was mostly used for just the chickens. It's a gentleman's farm, so let's get carried away a little bit. There were other structures that were a part of the farm itself, but for the most part, none of them were built out at World's End. The 251 acres that we call World's End Reservation. There was a small structure, as a sheepfold, that would have been good for some 100, maybe 150 sheep. That lasted for a while until the wild dogs got to them. But there's evidence beyond just the sheepfold that sheep were out there. As you walk out towards the last section of World's End, you'll notice a fairly large, substantial cedar post that's been pounded into the ground. That was the gate. That's all you needed, was one gate right there, because the rest of the land was an island at that point, and the sheep were kept out on the pasture. So again, this is all going on. The farm estate, the country estate was established, but John Brewer's getting older, and he needs to find out what he wants to do with all of his land. It's where all of his funds are held up, and he has children. He wants to leave for them some kind of inheritance. An inheritance comes for him then by way of his land. But he wasn't just going to give it to him. He was, again, he took 30 years to buy all of this land. He wasn't just going to then just turn it over. He was a planner, and he wanted a great plan for the land that he was to give to his children, something that was easy, kind of plug and play. Here's all of this land. It's already decided what's going to happen with it. Here's how you'll earn money off of it, and you'll be, taken care of for years to come. He ends up by finding a way to get a hold of Frederick Law Olmsted. John Brewer's elderly. At this time, Frederick Law Olmsted is elderly too. For anyone in the room who doesn't know who F.L. Olmsted was, I'll give a brief bio on him. America's first and foremost, most famous landscape architect. He designed Central Park in New York. He designed Boston's Emerald Necklace, stretching from the Common all the way to Franklin Park. He designed the grounds of the U.S. Capitol. He was instrumental in the preservation of the Yosemite Valley, as well as Niagara Falls. Chicago's World's Fair was his doing. And he worked with many notable architects at the time, including H.H. Richardson, probably America's one of maybe top 5 most influential architects. He was older. He had a full resume that he could rest on. Although 251 acres of Hingham Harborfront was nice, it wasn't quite Olmsted nice. It wouldn't have been something that he would have jumped on right away. But there was a mutual friend, and that's what this letter represents. There was a gentleman by the name of William Chandler, and I know you can all read that, right? Can someone in the far back want to read that for me? I'll read a transcript for you so you can get an idea of how these two, by chance, connected. William Chandler writes in 1866 to Mr. Fred Law Olmsted of Brookline, "Dear Sir, my friend John R. Brewer of this city has a large estate at Hingham on the harbor, which he has an idea that it would be well for him to have laid out. In talking with him about it, I suggested that he should have an interview with you and get your advice. And he requested me to write and ask you to name some time which would be convenient for you to meet him at my office. He is now at Hingham for the summer, and being something of an invalid, does not come regularly to the city. Therefore, in setting a date, please give me time enough to notify him. Very truly yours, William Chandler." At the top of the note, and you can see it in that diagonal, in Olmsted's handwriting, he scribbles 11:30 Thursday. And so the day was set. Olmsted came to World's End. He would have ridden around, probably in a horse and carriage, with John R. Brewer himself, and they would have speculated about the land. They would have looked at it and decided, well, this should stay, that shouldn't stay, here's where a cart path would be nice. They probably had a pretty good time. I know, we still have a good time when we go there today. So Olmsted loved a lot of what World's End was about. He loved spontaneous growth and ancient stone walls, things that he would have seen when he went to World's End. Now, again, coming back to being a ranger and being an engagement site manager, I can't tell you how many times people bring this up. Oh, this is an Olmsted landscape, right? Well, yeah, it is, sure. And people get all excited, and it's, they think it's an Olmsted park, though. They think, well, isn't this great? The guy who designed Central Park came to Hingham and designed a mini park for us. It's not the case. John R. Brewer hired Frederick Law Olmsted to design a residential subdivision, something that Olmsted was very good at. And here at World's End, he was designing for himself over 160 plots that were going to be laid out and have access to by tree-lined carriage paths. And it would have been probably a lovely place to live. That was the intent. That's what World's End got designed to be, and that's how Olmsted got involved. Olmsted produced a handful of drawings for World's End. But again, this was not a showstopper for him. He had other projects that were more notable that he gets remembered for. It's a unique, now you can look at it. It's a unique plan in that, it's dolled up. He shows all the trees along the cart paths. The specs are on there. He gives acreage for all the lots. But there's no contour lines. There was no tree planting list that went along with it, as far as we know. It's more or less a pretty graphic that was handed off to the Brewers, and he's basically said, okay, now you can put the Olmsted name on it. I hope you have a good time selling all these plots. Think about it that way. If you're a wealthy businessman and you can find a way to hire America's most famous landscape architect, that's a pretty good selling point. And perhaps that's part of what getting Olmsted to World's End was about. But nonetheless, it's an Olmsted plan, and a lot of it speaks to it. Even as you're looking at this, which does vary from what we actually experience at World's End in a couple of ways. But as you're looking at it, it's distinctively Olmsted. He was doing a couple things in his residential designs. Number one being this idea of pleasurable and leisurely travel. This idea that as you're moving through the landscape, it should be effortless. So you notice all the curving paths. And when you experience World's End now, when you walk through it, anywhere the cart paths ride a contour, or rather, they flatten out, the roads subtly curve. It always has a little bit of a reveal. You never know, quite what's around the bend. And then when they're not curving, they're probably rising up a hill. And again, you don't know what's over the crest. This is all part of anticipation, all part of a design intent to keep people moving through the landscape effortlessly. Just the idea of having a tree-lined cart path was pretty substantial. Again, this is a barren landscape. There are open fields. There's hardly any trees. There were some pockets of trees, but hardly any. And the idea of getting trees along them served two purposes. One, it did make it more pleasurable. You're not out there in the hot sun moving around getting to your house. Now you have a tree-lined, shaded cart path. And two, probably more importantly to Olmsted, was this idea of bringing nature back to people. So whether he was designing a park in a major metropolitan area, or he was doing one of these subdivisions, one of these residential areas, or in his work in conservation, he was bringing nature back into people's lives. This is important. He felt like it was instrumental to human health, that we should experience nature on a daily basis. And so by introducing trees, he brings trees back into people's lives. You can't get to your house without driving past numerous hundreds of trees and making that a part of your daily life. This was, subtle things he was doing. And, for whatever it's worth, not to get too technical, the roads themselves were pretty innovative at the turn of the century. Again, he gets hired in the 1880s. This plan at the top, it's dated 1890. We're talking about the turn of the century. Automobiles are about to come on the scene. Cities are booming. Industry is happening. It's no longer acceptable to have muddy, rutted roads. Roads need to be well kept, and they need to be well drained. And as you walk, World's End today, you'll notice a lot of work that went into these roads. Olmsted, in fact, studied the ancient roadways of Rome to understand how to build a road that would last. And some of that ingenuity went into these roads. You'll see the small ditches on the side of some of the roadways at World's End. Those are swales, and they're supposed to capture runoff. As rain falls on the roadways, the water drips off, ends up in these swales, or as water is coming out of the fields, they get captured in the swales before running over to the road. Most of the time they work. Sometimes they're a challenge for us. This is all Olmsted's design, and it worked out pretty well. Again, at this time, Olmsted, when he's designing World's End, he's elderly. He's only about 5 years removed from retirement, and after he retires, he's only 5 years removed then from passing away. He suffered terribly from dementia, and he actually ended up at McLean Hospital, a property that he designed in Waltham, and that's where he finished his life. So he's serving more as a figurehead, okay? He has his firm in Brookline. He's still putting his name on things. His name's still on the firm, but things are changing. His son, John Olmsted, is taking more of a leadership role, and another character by the name of Charles Elliott is taking a leadership role in the firm. Charles Elliott doesn't always get the credit for it, but he was probably more instrumental than Olmsted himself in the creation of the Emerald Necklace in Boston. He's highly influential when it comes to conservation in Massachusetts. Think the Blue Hills, Middlesex Fells, a handful of other what are now DCR properties at that time, MDC properties, Metropolitan District Commission properties. He was Olmsted's protege. He had a real knack for landscape architecture. He was very well spoken and was a great writer as well. And he had a good way of getting the message of landscape architecture out to the public and really making a case for the profession. And at this time, again, turn of the century, a conservation movement is starting primarily in Massachusetts. Groups like the Appalachian Mountain Club had already been established. Ideas about preservation out west had gotten started. But there was a real need now for something more. Again, industrialization is sweeping through, and many areas are being lost that otherwise would be worth saving. Note the date on the plan, 1890. World's End gets designed as a subdivision. Also in 1890, Charles Eliot, Olmsted's protege, writes an article for Garden and Forest magazine titled Waverly Oaks. And in that article, he talks about a stand of ancient and huge oak trees in the Waverly neighborhood of Belmont and the Belmont-Waltham line. These were quite the scene. People that used to just travel there, take a day trip just to see these trees. And he wrote in this article that they should be saved. They should be preserved somehow. Encroachment of development shouldn't be taking away these bits of scenery. And it wasn't just the oaks that he was concerned about. Again, he had a strong desire to preserve larger tracts of land. The Blue Hills. If you get to the top of Blue Hill, you'll notice a small plaque on the bridge that connects the tower. It bears his name. He was pretty influential up in the Blue Hills as well. But he proposes in this article that there should be an organization, some group of people that preserve landscapes. The same way that libraries collect books or museums collect artwork, there should be some group of people that collect landscapes for public use and enjoyment. Again, he comes from this Olmsted strain of the need to experience nature for the sake of human health. So he writes this article in 1890. The plan gets finalized in 1890. A year later, Eliot ends up by founding the Trustees of Reservations, an organization from 1891 that would go on 76 years later to save World's End forever from development. It's a very interesting crisscross of timetables, and it's interesting to see how one gentleman, Olmsted, forever shaped our interpretation of the property by providing these carriage roads and these trees, and his protege, who would have taken over as the figurehead of landscape architecture, Eliot, goes on to found an organization that will save this place from development. It's just fascinating endlessly, really. Pictured here, the more stately fellow on the left, that is Frederick Law Olmsted. And on the right, a little bit dweebishly, that is our Charles Eliot. This has to be one of my favorite photos that we dug up when we put together this display. It speaks to a lot of things. Yes, there was work that happened at World's End. It was a farm, but it certainly seems like guys had fun every once in a while. When we move past the Brewer era, we move past this introduction of Olmsted to the landscape, and we get into the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. World's End continues to get maintained, and for most of that time, as some of the structures were torn down of the old farm, and some of them burned down. The 251 acres that were out furthest in the water continued to get maintained. Trees were cared for, roads continued to get built and cared for, drainage ditches were cleared, fields were maintained, and more times than not, again, as technology improved and as the rest of the farming kind of goes away, there's about 3 guys who took care of the property, total. And this picture kind of speaks to that as well. And even today, we have a stewardship manager, and then we have under him a steward, and then we have a guy who's our livestock manager at Ware River Farm who gets sucked in a lot to doing work at World's End. 3 guys taking care of a property with some seasonal help every once in a while. As we move through into the 1900s, development does start. And this is a question we get quite frequently. Well, how come nothing got built out there? There was this plan, it would have been so valuable. How come nothing got built? Well, building did start. What you're looking at here is a chunk of land that sits between Seal Cove and Martin's Cove. As you're driving towards World's End, it's off to the off to the left. And it's part of the 24 acres that Brewer originally bought back in 1855. All this land got subdivided and got built upon, and it doesn't look too different now from when this plan got developed, aside from some subtle changes. Development continued, say into the 1950s. Boulder Glen Road, Porter's Cove Road, these areas got developed as well. Cedar Gables, which is not a term that people use often anymore, but is still used by people who live there. It's the last stretch of land before turning into World's End, that's off to the right, that got developed as well. And it was because of the stretch that's called Cedar Gables, where plots that went in that were a little bit smaller, that the town of Hingham decided to pass a little bit of legislation that said, anything that comes from John Brewer's old farm needs to be at least an acre in size to preserve aesthetics. We can't be cramming houses in here left and right. So some of these earlier plans, like this one here, the lots were at least an acre. And everything after Cedar Gables was required to be an acre. It was probably about 1933 or so that the trustees of reservations first inquired about World's End. Nothing came of it at that time, and being a part of the organization now, I can understand probably how that conversation went. Whoever was our director or someone on the board at the time went down, talked to the Walker family, and they said, "Well, you have a nice piece of property here. We're in the business of preserving property," and nothing came of it. They shook hands, and that was it. It wasn't until 1967 that a real desire to preserve this land came about. A woman by the name of Helen Brewer, who became Helen Brewer Walker, she was the granddaughter of John Brewer, was owning the property now. And her and her husband William, who again wrote the history of World's End, began the discussion of selling the property to the trustees of reservations. Timing worked out pretty well. Prior to this offer to purchase World's End, the trustees had acquired two properties out in the Berkshires. One of them, fairly notable, Namkeg, owned by Mabel Choate. Mabel was a huge proponent of the work of the trustees, and when she left her two properties, Mission House being the other one, to the trustees, she left a very sizable endowment. So for the first time in the organization's history, we had a little bit of capital. We didn't have to depend on people donating land to us the way that it had previously been done. But if the right opportunity came around and the land was worth it, we could play around with the idea of actually purchasing a property or a landscape. And it just so happened that, in '67, after a pretty serious push by the Metropolitan District Council, who had proposed for the preservation of certain landscapes all in and around Greater Boston, World's End included, that the arrangement between the trustees and the Walker family was really solidified. Now, again, up until this point, most of the land that the trustees acquired had been given to us, and not just given to us, it was given to us with an endowment so that work on each property could continue in perpetuity. But that was never in the cards for World's End. I mean, think about a family whose lineage goes back to John Brewer. He acquired all this land. That was his life's work. He had it all laid out, somehow got Olmsted to come there, and the idea all along was to sell it. It's an inheritance. And so a figure was drawn up to say this is what the price of the land should be, and that's what we'll agree upon. They settled on $650,000. So 1967, 251 acres, 5 miles of waterfront in the town of Hingham. Some of you can do the math. And work began. There was a couple of campaigns that got started. What ended up happening was The trustees said they'd pay $200,000 out of their pocket, and they'd arrange for 2 separate fundraising campaigns to get started, one being local and one being a little bit more far-reaching. The local one was led by a man named Sam Wakeman, who was a longtime Hingham resident. And he was able to raise the $200,000 primarily from folks in Hingham and Cohasset between the time of October of 1967 and January 1st of 1968. Really an unprecedented effort. And those funds came from roughly 1,800 different individuals. Really a far-reaching grassroots effort. The next effort that was more far-reaching was led by a gentleman who went by the name Monk. His name was Charles Mason. Charles ended up by getting involved. He loved World's End. He lived in the World's End neighborhood growing up, and he was the perfect person to finish the campaign. His was just as successful, and he ended up by getting funds from as far away as Illinois, where a farmer out there gave him a certain percentage of bushels of corn in order to sell and raise funds. So in 1967, after the funds are raised, World's End does become a public reservation. 2017, 50 years later, we're still celebrating the fact that this place has been preserved forever for public use. You know, that's pretty clear in the trustees' mission, is that we protect special places of historic and scenic value for the public. And I would have to think that, you know, as I picture people who visit the property today, as you know, we've gone through this anniversary year, and I've heard stories about people who've come to the property. I even read some reports from 1968 of when visitation first started there. It's certainly a place that people adore. They're drawn there, and if they're not sure what it's all about, all they know is it's a place that's called World's End, and it sounds kind of fun. And after they come, they return again and again. Because it's a place that people connect with. Again, it's a place that people have a relationship with. You don't go to World's End and walk the cart paths and leave the same person that you were when you crossed through the gate. Sam Wakeman had put together a letter to his chair committee as he was getting ready to start his campaign. And in it, he penned these words. Only 14 miles from downtown Boston, an island of beauty where we can still enjoy the satisfaction of lying in a field of warm grass and looking at the sky, where one can still watch wildlife undisturbed by the noise and confusion of the city, where we can still walk on beaches washed by the sea without seawalls and hot dog concessions, and where we can turn momentarily to simple pleasures such as seeing a child explore the mysteries of the coming spring. I think that rings true today. I see families come to World's End, and kids put down the cell phones and pick up a rock and learn how to skip it. I've literally seen children playing with a remote control car, and then they see a fox run by, and immediately their attention is grabbed by something that's more significant than their kind of fleeting hobby that's in front of them. There's folks who go there almost every day, and we say hi to them every morning just the same, and they come for all kinds of reasons, and it's important to them. I think that people develop this relationship with World's End because there's a familiarity with the landscape, right? A lot of people go there and they say, isn't this great? I get to spend some time in nature. And I always get a little chuckle out of that because I think, well, yeah, I guess there's trees and there's fields and a little bit of woods, but this is a heavily manipulated landscape. Look at all the work the colonial settlers did. Look at what John Brewer did when he was here. But I understand too what they mean, and you know, whether or not it's perceived by visitors when they walk past the stone walls or under the carriage road trees, when they walk through some of the wooded areas, what they're experiencing, at least from my perspective, is a connection with the people who came before them. And there's a built-in familiarity in the landscape because people have been there before. And when you walk through there, you're immediately put at ease, and you feel like you know the place, like going into your parents' old attic, or you know, visiting a friend you haven't seen for a long time. You didn't know any of the people who came to World's End before you, but you know they were there by the things they've left behind. And then you develop your own relationship with it, and that's what forms the story of World's End. This continuing formation of our stories as we tell them. Sometimes they're mixed in with some emotion and feelings that distort some of the facts, and that's part of it, though. I know I've done that myself. You get excited about the idea of what this landscape could mean, and then you have to go back and look at the history books and see, well, maybe not so much. But that is the story of World's End. It's man's relationship with the landscape. And it truly is a heritage property now, not just for the town folks of Hingham, but everyone on the South Shore, like the folks in Cohasset who helped contribute, some of the kids who donated their piggy banks from Weymouth, and whoever that farmer was out in Illinois who gave us those bushels of corn. So thank you folks so much. I know went a little long, but thank you very much. If you do have some questions, I'd be happy to go through it. First, over there.
When Brewer and these other people were buying the farms, who were they buying it from? The town of Hingham or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? Or who owned it?
Privately owned, right? So World's End, if you go through it now, you see some old stone walls, you see some tree lines. They speak to property lines that would have been privately owned. So when Brewer comes through, he's... Yeah, before that, so we talk about the first colonists, the forefathers of Hingham, and for World's End's sake, we call them the original planters. For lack of a better terms, I would call it squatters' rights. I mean, this is colonial era. Yeah, but once you start, developing it and you build some value into it, then sales begin. So.
Who named it World's End?
I knew that question was coming. Yeah.
Was there an effort by the government to buy that property at one time?
I'm glad you brought that up. I think I overlooked two massive pieces of the World's End story. One of them being a proposal for the property to be the United Nations site. It was shortlisted as a site for it. I even heard recently that it's not as scary as it sounds. It was shortlisted as a Boston site. So perhaps there was about 5 locations in Boston that the UN could have been. And there could have been about 5 locations in New York, maybe 5 locations in Chicago. But nonetheless, a list of 5 or a list of 20, that's still a pretty short list to be on if you're World's End. And then after that, into 1960, there was a proposal to use this property for a nuclear power plant. That plant did get built, not at World's End, but down on Route 3A in Plymouth. It's called the Pilgrim Plant. So my apologies for skipping over two major threats. One piece of it that some folks don't always hear is that actually World's End proper, the farthest reach that's pictured here, was actually taken over by the military for a short time and was barred off, and no one else could get out there. It's the same way most of the harbor islands had been used for military exercises or for defense purposes. That would have been post-World War II. So, any other questions? No? To touch on the one that you had, why is it called World's End? We get that question all the time, and unfortunately we don't have a good answer. It's always been called World's End, and even if you look at some of the earliest maps of the town of Hingham, it says World's End. And ironically, some of the early maps, the entire town is framed nicely and there's a nice border around it, but World's End juts out of the frame and breaks the border and it sticks way out there, like literally, like it's off the map. I would think that World's End somehow got its name for a couple of reasons. One, think about the effort it took some of these colonial settlers to get out there. First by boat or barge, then they built these dams and these causeways. If you were going through all that effort to get to this chunk of land that you'd consider the very end of your town, you might call it World's End too. There's another riddle that has to do with fox hunts at the property. The fox kind of serves as a mascot for World's End. You can still see them there. They still have dens. The kids come out in the spring, April, like they always do. There was fox hunts, and through the mid to late 1800s, hunters would ride on horseback through the town of Hingham, chase the foxes of the town through World's End, and when they finally got to this narrow section, the bar, and chased them all to World's End, that was it. That was the fox's end. It was the end of the world for the fox. They had nowhere else to go. So, but
Is there a pervasiveness of deer out here like there is in the
yeah, there are a lot of deer that inhabit World's End, and my best understanding is that the same deer that hang out at World's End are the same ones that you'll find in Wampatuck State Park, and even out to the Harbor Islands. They swim out there. So that's kind of their range. Yes, there's certainly a lot of them. Is there too many? Yeah, I'm not an ecologist. I wouldn't say one way or another, but I would certainly say that that's a debate amongst ecologists, not just at World's End, but throughout New England. With more and more development, deer, their habitat is woodland edge, and so the more holes you punch in the woods, the more habitat there is for deer, and the more hostas we plant, the more tasty food there are for them. So, any other questions? No? Well, thanks again, folks. Really appreciate it. I hope you join us next week. Okay?